Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to Antarctica Now. I'm Martin Brooks and I'm one of the co-founders of Shackleton here in the UK, and I'd like to start just by talking a little bit about Antarctica Now and how it's come to be. So in any given year, as well as the 50 or thousands or so visitors that arrive on cruise ships, there would normally be around 4,000 people living and working in the Antarctic summer season. Researchers, scientists, expedition support teams, pilots, chefs, plumbers, all kinds of people. And of course, there would be adventurers and explorers, people trekking to the pole, climbing Mount Vincent, and laying down new routes to new places. This season, however, because of COVID, Antarctica is effectively closed. Ships aren't sailing, planes aren't flying, and so in a continent that's almost twice as big as the USA, there are fewer than 1,000 people down there, based either at McMurdo Station or at the South Pole itself or any of the other permanent bases. And a lot of the people that would normally be there are instead stuck at home. And I know some of them are actually tuning in to this Zoom tonight. And that group of people actually includes some of the members of the Shackleton team in our team in London who had a major expedition planned for this year, who unfortunately we've had to postpone it till next year. So what to do? Well, you know, Antarctica is where Shackleton's story was written a century ago, and it's where our modern cold weather gear is tested and used. But given that none of us can get there this year, we thought it would be a really great idea to bring Antarctica to you and back into our homes. So if like me, you're lucky enough to have visited Antarctica, you'll know there's no shortage of great subjects to engage and discuss. It's been hard, but we boiled the 7 days of Antarctica Now down into 8 live talks and around 16 journal pieces, photos, stories, all kinds of brilliant content on our website, covering wildlife conservation, exploration, ice science, space, politics, photography, and more. So be sure to get involved with the website, and there's lots of opportunities for you to have your say and give us your impressions of Antarctica. So thanks again for joining us. Today for our first event, we really wanted to establish the context for the week ahead. And to do this, we're really delighted to welcome Professor Klaus Dodds to address the question, who wields power in Antarctica? Professor Dodds lectures in geopolitics at the Royal Holloway in London and has held a visiting fellowship at Oxford University. He's visited the Antarctic on 4 separate occasions and is a trustee of the Royal Geographical Society, as well as being an honorary fellow of British Antarctic Survey. He's also a prolific writer. The many books which he has authored and co-authored include Scramble for the Poles, The Contemporary Geopolitics of the Arctic and Antarctic, Pink Ice, Britain in the South Atlantic Empire. His other works tackle everything from global power struggles to the geopolitics of James Bond, which I've had a look at and is fascinating. Professor Dodds is a leading expert on how political tensions have been growing in the region of Antarctica. And tonight he explains why he thinks the Antarctic could be on the brink of an international power struggle. We feel very lucky to have him here, and later this week, he's speaking at an event for NATO. And right at the end of his talk, we'll be asking him some questions, so please use the Q&A function on the Zoom bar to lodge any questions that you have, and I'll pick some of those and put them to Professor Dodds at the end. So without further ado, Klaus, welcome to Antarctica Now. We're very excited to hear what you've got to say, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation, Martin, and thank you to everybody else who's been at the heart of the organisation of this incredible virtual festival. And hello to everybody who is participating. And it's a really great pleasure to come and speak to you, albeit virtually, about the Antarctic and to try and give some substance to this extraordinary continent, which, despite lacking an indigenous human population, is not short of geopolitical intrigue and certainly governance conundrums that I'll try and tease out for you. And what I should be doing, I hope, is sharing my screen with you now. And this will, in a sense, guide us through what I'd like to try and tackle with you tonight, which is really responding to the question that Martin and Rachel, who also helped bring this festival to fruition, posed to me, which is this: who wields power in the Antarctic? And so this is what I'm going to try and address for you, and along the way give you a sense of how the geopolitics and governance of the Antarctic has changed. And I think one of the key things to say right at the start is it's really a remarkable short, I suppose, history of human encounter, with last year in particular being the 200th anniversary of the first known sighting of the continent itself. And of course, in keeping with the spirit and the sense of contestation, three countries, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia, all claim that particular honor. So, first things first, the Antarctic, or Antarctica, is in essence an enormous continent that Martin's already explained is very large, surrounded by an immense southern ocean. And the Antarctic continent is, as I say, the only continent that has never had an indigenous human population. And thanks to the extraordinary investment of time and energy and technological innovation, we're able to show you an image like this that gives a very granular sense of the continent's topography. And one of the things that will strike you, I hope, fairly quickly, looking at this rather splendid visual representation provided by the European Space Agency, is that we often talk about the Antarctic as being composed of two parts: the Western Antarctic, where you might see on the left-hand side with the Antarctic Peninsula that is closest to South America, and then the immense East Antarctic, which is to the right side of the image in front of you. And for those of you who have traveled to the Antarctic by ship, which makes up really about 90% of contemporary Antarctic tourism, it's highly likely that you visited the Antarctic Peninsula part of the continent, and perhaps some of the surrounding islands like South Shetland, further afield like South Georgia, and depending on the trip that you undertook, particularly ones that are a little longer, you might have also taken in, for example, the Falkland Islands. So that's, in essence, the sort of very basic physical geography of the continent. Two elements, the Antarctic Peninsula closest to South America, and as I say, this very, very large Southern Ocean. Now, the other thing as well to say about the Antarctic, and particularly the polar continent, is that it's the fifth largest continent of the world. It has the notable distinction of holding 90% of the world's ice. So, for example, whenever we have a conversation about sea level rise and how that might affect us globally, then unsurprisingly, attention turns to the Antarctic and, of course, Greenland, because these really are the two most significant bodies of ice that we have on our planet. East and West Antarctica, that I've already identified, are bifurcated by the Trans-Antarctic mountain range that sort of separates them, as I've hinted at, and 99% of the continent is covered in ice, and that 1%, or where you might find, for example, exposed rock, is again in the main to be found in the Antarctic Peninsula, but there's also a very special area called the Dry Valleys that is also free of ice. One of the things, of course, that we're concerned about, given the warming trends affected the Antarctic Peninsula, is that those bits that are most affected by warming are starting to greenify. And so it's, as with the Arctic, we're finding increasingly that scientists are talking about a greening or browning polar regions to give us an indication, if you will, of the scale and pace of change. The ice is very, very thick, particularly in the East Antarctic. And for those of you who are interested in your polar points, There are actually 7 poles that can be identified. Of course, the most famous being the South Pole, which Amundsen and Scott famously sought in and around 1911 and 1912. You'll see the map above again, reminding you of that east and west Antarctic distinction. But the one below, I think, is in some ways for me, quite remarkable, which is a representation of the cross section, as if you were running across the continent, giving you a sense of the scale, the depth, and importantly, the volume of the polar continent. And one of the most remarkable achievements, I think, that scientists have really brought to us is this incredibly sophisticated view of the continent as a volume, as opposed to simply a kind of surface area that we began to map, however incompletely, from the 19th century onwards. And of course, by the time the Antarctic was first sighted in and around the 1820s, one of the things, of course, to bear in mind is that the Antarctic had been imagined, of course, for centuries beforehand. So what's important about this last 200 years is this transition from imagining that there must be a great southern land or polar continent to actually encountering it. And then more than that, from going beyond that first contact to actually establishing a great deal more of human activity. Some of that, of course, that activity was initially, of course, most obvious at sea through activities like whaling and sealing. But subsequently, of course, as predominantly men ventured further into and onto the continent, so of course our discoveries and our explorations continued apace. But it's not necessarily a straightforward linear story. The last 200 years have seen phases, if you will, of more intense contact or more intense exploration, discovery, and then these sort of windows where actually there was less engagement with the Antarctic, some of it for understandable reasons, such as war, for example. And of course, maps tell a wonderful story of how our geographical understanding of the Antarctic has changed over time. So I've just put here for you 2 examples, one from 1898 and then one from 1921. And one of the things that you'll note if you were to take, I suppose, a transection of Antarctic maps, certainly over the last 100 years, you slowly but surely see the detail emerge as the Antarctic is better mapped, as it's mapped, for example, by land, as it's mapped via sea. And then, of course, most dramatically, we start to get mapping and surveying by air as we go well into the 20th century. And then most recently, of course, satellites have proven absolutely integral to developing more sophisticated 3-dimensional maps of the Antarctic. So again, it's a really intriguing story of how the Antarctic comes to be known as a distinct continent surrounded by this ocean. Really up to the 1940s, for example, there was a great deal of speculation, uncertainty about whether the Antarctic continent, the polar continent, was composed of 1 or 2 elements, whether they were joined together, whether they were separate, covered by an immense layer of ice. There was a great deal of uncertainty about the composition of the Antarctic. So the maps play a part, if you like, in helping to chart and archive or even curate our understanding and how it became, over time, progressively more sophisticated, more volumetric, I suppose. And of course, it would be absolutely remiss of me not to talk about the importance of exploration and discovery. After all, Shackleton looms large in the midst of this week-long celebration of all things Antarctic. And Britain, of course, was really at the forefront of exploration and discovery in the context of Antarctica. And a whole series of expeditions, particularly from the earliest parts of the 20th century, played a pivotal role in not only exploring and discovering that said continent and surrounding oceans and islands, but also helping to radically, if you like, enhance public engagement, public interest in the Antarctic. And of course, both Scott and Shackleton, as heroic personalities, played a key role in engaging the public in terms of what indeed was at stake in the Antarctic, but also becoming, certainly in Scott's case, becoming an opportunity also to both mourn and also celebrate the achievements of the party that, of course, famously arrived at the South Pole second after Amazon. So the Scott Polar Research Institute at the University of Cambridge, founded in the early 1920s, is a direct consequence of public donations and a public appeal to commemorate and to celebrate the achievements of Scott and his party. Shackleton's story is somewhat different, but I think it's interesting as well when you look at both Scott and Shackleton over time. The public visibility of both men and their expeditions varies considerably. So, for example, in Shackleton's case, I mean, as Scott's reputation was suffering somewhat in the 1970s and 1980s, Shackleton's reputation was steadily enhanced in the 1990s onwards. And indeed, famously, after the September the 11th attacks of 2001, there were some people saying that actually, in terms of leadership, there was still much we could indeed learn from Shackleton and his extraordinary exploits in terms of enduring huge hardship and, of course, his story of survival and rescue. So this legacy of exploration and discovery is a very lively one. It's not just simply part of our history, it remains part of our contemporary engagement with the Antarctic. We are still very influenced in this country by our polar traditions, our polar heroics, and actually how we commemorate and remember them. But of course, the other thing that is really striking about the 20th century, as the human engagement increases with the Antarctic, is there's an awful lot of working powers, I've called it. So as expeditions become more numerous, and Britain, of course, is not alone in all of this, so the men who find themselves in the Antarctic are put to work. So part of that work is literally claiming territory, in this case, for Britain, or for example, Dominion allies such as Australia and New Zealand, building bases, mapping, surveying, but also writing about those exploits. And so I've just given you an example there, which is from the 1950s, is the famous Trans-Antarctic expedition involving Sir Vivian Fuchs and Sir Edmund Hillary, which saw a sort of Commonwealth mechanized crossing of the Antarctic in the late 1950s. All of these activities were considered to be terribly important in enabling Britain and its allies to develop a substantial foothold in the Antarctic. And it wasn't just, of course, men mapping and surveying and building bases, it was also based on commercial activity as well. So whaling and sealing were tremendously important in the commercial exploitation of the Antarctic. Britain and Norway were at the epicenter of a whaling industry based out of South Georgia that was hugely influential in the commercial exploitation of the Antarctic. And whalebone, for example, was famously used in clothing. Whale oil was considered to be a strategic commodity. And it's worth bearing in mind that commercial whaling really only ended in the early 1960s. So an awful lot, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of whales were hunted, killed, and processed in the Antarctic. Now, why did all this matter? Well, of course it mattered because by the 1940s, the Antarctic map was becoming a great deal more complicated and controversial. So if you remember those maps I showed you of atlases trying to outline or depict how the Antarctic looked, well, there was another map that could be drawn that was starting to take shape in the 1940s, where we could actually talk about 7 countries that had made formal claims to the Antarctic. The British were the first in 1908, and then others followed between 1908 and the 1940s. And the thing that would strike you about this map is the Australian Antarctic territory, representing about 42% of the polar continent, is enormous. The British claim overlaps considerably with the Argentine and Chilean. The Norwegian claim came about in the late 1930s, in part out of fear that Nazi Germany might make a claim to the continent. And New Zealand and France are the 2 other claimant states. Importantly, there was and remains an unclaimed sector, the so-called Pacific Ocean sector, and later it became clear that the United States and the Soviet Union would not make a claim, but they would nonetheless reserve the right to make a claim. So what you see, if you like, on that map is the current situation. We have 7 claimant states, we have an unclaimed sector, we have 1 sector of the Antarctic that is claimed by 3 parties, 2 major powers reserve the right, and everybody else has not accepted any of those claims. So the 1940s set the condition for the subsequent iteration of Antarctic geopolitics. And the image you see in the middle is an image of Operation Tabarin, which was a secret wartime operation launched by the British to cement their presence in the Antarctic, largely in response to fears that the Argentines, the Chileans, and the Americans were all showing enhanced interest in the Antarctic. And there was a concern that if Britain didn't do more in terms of build more bases, put more men on the ice, then our claim might be in jeopardy. Now, one of the reasons why the Antarctic was gaining so much more interest, particularly after the Second World War, was a sort of growing recognition that the Antarctic could no longer be reasonably thought as an isolated, marginal, geographically irrelevant space. Thanks to post-war science, there was a growing understanding that the Antarctic was intimately related to planet Earth. So in other words, it wasn't just somehow this disconnected space that just was filled with ice. There was a growing recognition that ice, water, air were all interconnected with one another, and the Antarctic played an important role in helping to shape global oceans and global climate. The International Geophysical Year of 1957-1958 is often been told via Sputnik and rockets and missiles and outer space activity, but actually the Antarctic was absolutely pivotal to the IGY. And the IGY did something very, very important. It really helped to globalize the Antarctic. It helped to reimagine the Antarctic, not as this sort of claimed, counterclaimed space, but actually more like a scientific or an environmental space where scientists had to be able to collaborate with one another in order to address really, really big, pressing global problems. And maybe this took on an added urgency during the Cold War period, of course, when all of this was occurring, because missiles and nuclear weapons had also highlighted the fragility of the Earth. The way in which, of course, the Antarctic subsequently developed is in large part due to a remarkable treaty called the 1959 Antarctic Treaty. And actually what the treaty did was use science as power. The treaty found a mechanism through science to engender cooperation and goodwill. Famously, the treaty, negotiated in the autumn of 1959, also asked all parties, and there were 12 of them, to put to one side their disagreements over the ownership of the Antarctic, and instead to focus on the Antarctic as a kind of natural laboratory, that actually this remarkable space should be an opportunity for goodwill, for cooperation, for peace, and in other words, to think of this part of the world as actually quite distinct politically and legally. And it's worth bearing in mind that the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 effectively established Antarctica as the world's first nuclear weapon-free zone. And this idea of the Antarctic as a natural laboratory was an incredibly seductive one. You know, this sense in which science really should prevail and be incredibly important. Because if we could not conduct science in a peaceful way in an enormous continent without an indigenous human population, then what chance would we have anywhere else in the world? So the Antarctic Treaty, which helped to revolutionize Antarctic geopolitics and governance, to this day, I think, is still widely regarded as a hugely admirable and innovative model. And this idea of the natural laboratory, of course, proved to be even more appealing as entities like NASA, for example, began to conduct some of their space training operations in the Antarctic. And so this idea of the Antarctic being a kind of proxy for the moon or outer space also became very, very popular. One of the things, of course, that makes the Antarctic Treaty possible is the idea that governance has to be on the basis of consensus. And part of the way in which consensus is secured is through the work of science and scientific knowledge. So bodies like SCAR, for example, play a hugely important role in providing expert advice to those who are parties to the Antarctic Treaty. And consensus, of course, has its upsides and its downsides. The upsides is that every member or consultative party to the treaty has, in essence, an equal vote. The downside is that in order to secure consensus, sometimes parties don't always act as decisively as they might, or sometimes, for example, issues or concerns that could become the object of contention or dispute tend to be resolved as quietly and as far away from the gaze of publicity as possible, which of course has led, and this is the flip side of all of this, to accusations in the past and present that the governance of Antarctica can be rather opaque, that it isn't always as transparent as it might be. But there's another element that I think often gets lost if we're not careful about the story of Antarctica. And given this focus on power and really recognizing that power over or power on can take many, many shapes and dimensions, it's also worth just saying that if you're not careful, you can also forget that so much of this story that I'm telling is really one that is dominated by men from very, very few countries. Until quite recently, Antarctica and the governance of Antarctica as well, for that matter, was dominated by men from those 12 original signatory states that were party to the Antarctic Treaty. And the picture that you see of those 6 women in the top left is the first women to arrive at the South Pole in 1969, about the same time, of course, that men were landing for the first time on the moon. And although women had been in the Antarctic before 1969, as Janie Darlington's wonderful book recalling her time in the Antarctic in the late 1940s makes clear, it is a story overwhelmingly told and shaped by men. And one of the reasons why women were absent for a long time was that national Antarctic programs were really quite reluctant to embrace women in the Antarctic, in part because there was a worry that if you were to introduce women into Antarctic environments, particularly scientific stations or bases, then that somehow might be disruptive and work against the sort of the rhythms of scientific and base life. More recently, organizations such as British Antarctic Survey and others have been at the forefront of working with underrepresented groups and communities to try and further diversify polar science and indeed polar history. So there's lots of really important initiatives going on at the moment to tell, quite rightly, different kinds of stories about the Antarctic that don't always seem to pivot around the diplomatic or the geopolitical, because that in itself often ends up being really very limiting. And just as an aside, on one of the trips I made to the Antarctic, I was giving a talk about British Antarctic policy, and a woman at the back of the ship put her hand up and wanted to ask a question, and it was a very, very good question that I struggled to answer. And she subsequently identified herself as Dame Margaret Anstey, and very, very distinguished diplomat. And she told me that her first job had been in the Foreign Office, working with the Polar Administrator, Brian Roberts. And one of her great frustrations was that she was not allowed to go to the Antarctic because she was a woman. 50 plus years later, here she was talking with me as we were sailing somewhere through the Drake's Passage. So it was an incredible moment and a very, very humbling conversation with Dame Margaret at that particular point. So that's a really important thing to bear in mind about power over, power on, and some of that is just simply about access. Now, by the 1970s, Antarctica was being considered in a very different kind of light, which was as an emerging and new, I suppose, resource frontier. So in the past, of course, if you recall, I said that commercial whaling was dying out in the 50s and really largely ceased by the early 60s. By the 70s, the idea of the Southern Ocean as a really very promising resource frontier was absolutely back in full public gaze. Now, part of the interest in the Southern Ocean was not only fish, but also krill, the shrimp-like creature that you see there depicted. And of course, this period in the 1970s coincided with anxieties that there might be limits to growth, that there were going to be population time bombs. And you even have some authors suggesting that the growing populations in Asia and Africa might be fed krill as part of this sort of vision of preserving food supplies in the face of mounting population. I don't think, frankly speaking, krill would be a particularly attractive source of food for humans, but it captures something of an anxiety that the Antarctic's wealth, its living resource wealth, was going to be targeted again by distant water fishing fleets. And that led to a very significant international convention dealing with marine living resources, CAMLR, that tried to reimagine the Southern Ocean as a series of distinct conservation management fishing zones, as you can see in the map in the center, and really produced very different kinds of maps to the ones that we saw, say, in the 1920s. Now you had the Southern Ocean being imagined as marine spatial planning. And that gives you a sense of how quickly in those 40 to 50 years, we've actually got a very different view of the Antarctic, where science, and particularly fisheries science, has become extraordinarily important in trying to shape current and future resource use. Tourism is also taking off in this period. Some of the cruise tourism that you might be familiar with really starts in its heyday, I suppose, in the late 1950s, but this kind of expedition style tourism starts to gain momentum. And as Martin was saying at the start, you know, we now have something like 50,000 plus visitors. Clearly the pandemic has interfered with that, But tourism is becoming increasingly important, and still the United States as the largest market. But one of the great changes has been, of course, is the rise of Chinese polar tourism that I'm quite certain will continue to rise in significance post-pandemic, if we can talk about that. But again, it's a really important point to recognize that the Antarctic is being exploited in different sorts of ways. So it's not just about the extraction of whales, seals, fish, and krill, but now the Antarctic's aesthetic beauty is also being exploited commercially by tourism. And much of that tourism, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is ship-based. Now, all of this comes into sharp relief in the 1980s, when I think it's absolutely reasonable to say that we have contested Antarctica. We have all these different visions of the Antarctic sitting or rubbing up against one another awkwardly. So we have this idea of the Antarctic as a natural laboratory where science should really be the dominant activity. We have Antarctica as a resource frontier. We have Antarctica as a tourist hotspot. We have Antarctica as a place where unsavory activities, such as scientific whaling by Japan, continues. Environmental organizations, countries from the global south are beginning to make their concerns heard. Greenpeace famously sets up a base in Antarctica and declares that Antarctica should be a world park. Political leaders like Bob Hawke, the bottom right, find themselves in a dilemma. So Prime Minister Hawke of Australia had previously been open to the idea that maybe, just maybe, resources, mineral resources in particular, could be regulated in advance, just in case the Antarctic's mineral wealth became accessible or exploitable, or even thought in those sorts of ways. Now, part of the pressure that was sort of gaining around this idea of contested Antarctica was also coming from the simple fact that in the 1980s, more countries were getting involved in Antarctic governance, most notably China and India in the early 1980s. So you had this sort of cacophony of noise with people making demands and the Antarctic being subject to these really very different kinds of understandings. You know, what was the Antarctic? Science, resource, mineral space, tourism hotspot. It was all up for grabs. And famously, in the late 1980s, Australia and France very publicly backed away from those negotiations over minerals and made a pitch that was later supported, that Antarctica really needed to be seen as a protected wilderness. And this is where largely we are today, the Antarctic as the protected space, the Antarctic as an extraordinary but vulnerable wilderness that needs to be looked after, to be stewarded, rather than just simply exploited. And again, what we're finding is different kinds of maps are starting to be drawn, thinking about the Antarctic as a different kind of space. And so, for example, the map on the right is looking at the Antarctic as biogeographical regions. Well, that's a very different map to some of the very earliest maps that simply thought of the Antarctic as a blank space, where, you know, we were lucky to have barely an outline to this extraordinary continent. Now, most recently, of course, the Antarctic is associated, quite rightly so, with climate change. And it would be really unthinkable now not to correlate concern with climate change with concern with the polar regions. So both the Arctic and the Antarctic have been linked very, very powerfully to this idea of vulnerable, melting, disappearing ice shelves, sea ice, and a sense that both these extraordinary polar spaces are at risk because of unrelenting warming. So this idea of the Antarctic being vulnerable or imperiled by human activity, by effectively the Industrial Revolution, also, of course, speaks to an extraordinary transformation in our understanding of ice. If 200 years ago, ice was considered terrifying, we could arguably say that we are terrifying ice. In other words, that this sort of our relationship with ice has changed significantly in the intervening period. We are now far more likely to think of ice rather as vulnerable or as simply melting away, with all then the knock-on consequences for things like sea level rise. This is important because it also helps to explain the ongoing and indeed intensifying interest in the Antarctic, particularly amongst countries that have come to the Antarctic relatively late. If the melting ice caps have implications for sea level, for example, which is global, then who or what can be interested in the Antarctic or the Arctic is considerably expanded. And this sense of endangerment and vulnerability has also, of course, not only just affected the ice in the polar continent, but it's also, I think, placed renewed focus on the Southern Ocean as well. So we've seen over the last decade a huge amount of interest in the establishment of marine protected areas, or if you like, as you see there on the top left, Antarctic sanctuaries. This idea that the Southern Ocean needs more marine protection, more measures to prevent, for example, illegal or excessive fishing as part of a global strategy to respond, if you will, to the pressures, the ongoing pressures of climate change, and specifically of things like ocean acidification and fish stock vulnerabilities. So again, we're seeing different sorts of maps here being used to convey different sorts of understandings of the Antarctic. So in the 1970s and 80s, if it really been about trying to regulate resource exploitation, now increasingly we're trying to restrict resource exploitation. We're actually trying to say we need to have more no-take zones because of the extraordinary changes and concerns that we have. Now that, of course, has lent itself to increasing focus on Antarctica as a space for great power competition. This term, great power competition, has waxed and waned in geopolitical discourse, but I think it'd be perfectly reasonable to argue that in the last 5 years, it's had a considerable renaissance, this sense in which Russia, China, the United States in particular, are pursuing very different global projects, and the Arctic and the Antarctic are not spared these rivalries. Now, some of these rivalries also spill over and affect close allies. So, for example, Australia and New Zealand, who work very, very closely with the United States and have done so for a very long time, also find themselves caught up in all kinds of tensions that really stress test the Antarctic Treaty and this idea of the Antarctic as a zone of peace. So we had a very interesting case recently where Russia and New Zealand were trading accusations and counter-accusations about whether this vessel, the Palmer, a Russian vessel, was illegally fishing. And the two countries, interestingly, were arguing over data. You know, where was the vessel? And so what you see is 1 and 2 is arguments about where one party thought the ship was and where the other party thought the ship was. So the Russians claim they're at point 1, the New Zealanders claim they're at point 2. And one of the things that's really been very noticeable, and I think the recent Trump administration brings this out quite nicely as well, is when science, expertise, and truth claims are thrown into sharp relief, where there's doubt or where parties actively seek to undermine certainty, then that has very, very real consequences for an Antarctic treaty system that is based on the legitimacy, the authority, the power of science and robust knowledge claims. And if, for example, parties start to get a little bit more suspicious of one another, if there's a sense in which information is not being freely exchanged, then it's very easy also to find yourself falling into narratives that talk about the Antarctic as this contentious space. So infrastructure is always subject to scrutiny in the Antarctic. If, for example, you need research stations, infrastructure to move and to do things in the Antarctic, then if one party, for example, establishes some kind of runway or enhances its Antarctic station or improves its communication systems, that can lead to fears, justified or unjustified, that they may be seeking to do something more nefarious. So it's been very striking to see, for example, Australian media report fairly consistently concerns about what China might be doing in the Antarctic, because so much of Chinese activity is in the Australian Antarctic territory. And yet also Australia finds itself in a bind when it wants to expand its infrastructural presence, because then of course environmentalists are saying, why is Australia intensifying its impact on various parts of the Antarctic? So you will find heart-warming stories about parties still managing to collaborate with one another, particularly when it comes to emergency situations, and I wouldn't want to underestimate that. But there is this sort of background, I think, of a growing suspicion and concern that you can't necessarily trust what others are up to. And that also affects us in the UK. You know, we have an overlapping claim with Argentina and Chile. It's no surprise if I was to say that we probably have warmer relations with Chile than we do with Argentina. And a lot of that, frankly speaking, is still a legacy of the Falklands conflict from 1982. But all sides, Argentina, Chile, the United Kingdom, are concerned about their presence in their respective national territories. So in 2012, for example, Foreign Secretary William Hague announced that a large part of British Antarctic territory was henceforth to be known as Queen Elizabeth Land. Now, unsurprisingly, that upset Argentina and Chile as we updated our maps and marked out Queen Elizabeth Land. They know perfectly well the power of place naming and how in the Antarctic, flags, maps, place names all play a part in consolidating one's presence. And for example, the United Kingdom also uses the Royal Air Force to help support Britain's scientific presence in the British Antarctic territory. Now, to us, that makes perfectly reasonable sense. Militaries are allowed to support civilian scientific operations under the terms of the Antarctic Treaty. But for others, of course, they begin to wonder why on earth the RAF is operating in Antarctica. So to come to a sort of towards the end of what I wanted to say this evening, I think I want to leave you with a sort of a cautious sense that the Antarctic Treaty system and the Antarctic Treaty of 1959 still remains a remarkable treaty. If you were to read the treaty, it's a very short treaty, but it really sets out a very hopeful vision of the Antarctic. But we shouldn't be complacent. I think there are things that we will need to watch carefully, particularly if China, Russia, the United States continue to jostle with one another to shape the world in their own image. The pandemic has had paradoxical consequences. Martin said, of course, quite rightly, that human activity in the Antarctic has declined as a consequence of the pandemic. But on the other hand, China and Russia have been accused of trying to take advantage of this sort of quiet period as a consequence of this public health emergency. There continues to be concern about what satellite communication systems might be used for. And in particular, we'll see ongoing concerns about the use of so-called dual-use technology. So again, infrastructure is never politically innocent in the Antarctic, and that applies to all countries. not least because the ownership of the Antarctic is not settled. So when we talk about who wields power in Antarctica, there are lots of things we can talk about. We can talk about the power of the imagination, we can talk about power of infrastructure, the power of states and other things. But we also shouldn't underestimate the power of other bodies who we, until recently, we wouldn't have thought about as having an impact on Antarctica. The International Maritime Organization is one example. We also shouldn't underestimate the enduring importance of scientific cooperation as a way of building relationships and cementing, if you like, networks and cooperative associations. So the United States and Britain have a very important collaboration in and around Thwaites Glacier. It's been an incredibly important way for both countries to reinforce a special relationship, if you will, on the ice and off the ice. And then finally, to finish with, and I'm very, very happy to take any questions or comments, I just also want to just pay due recognition to some wonderful resources that are out there if you're interested in learning more about the governance and the geopolitics and the geographies of the Antarctic. We've got some really nice materials provided by the British Library. There's a wonderful website developed by the Foreign Office, the Royal Geographical Society, and the British Antarctic Survey called Discovering Antarctica. There's a lovely new atlas produced by Peter Freightwell, who works for British Antarctic Survey, that has stunning representations of Antarctica. And there are other resources, two of whom I mentioned there. One is British Antarctic Survey, and we shouldn't forget the splendid polar vessels, Sir David Attenborough, that will be doing more Antarctic science and Arctic science very, very soon. And lots of educational and academic resources exist now to really, really help, I hope, public understanding of this remarkable continent. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you very, very much for your attention. And I'm very, very happy to take any questions if you have them. Thank you again.
Klaus, that was absolutely fantastic. And I can tell from the number of questions that are coming in that you've really engaged a lot of people from all over the world on, with a lot of the subjects that you've brought up. We've got about 15 very good questions, lots of others, but there's 15 which I won't hit you with 15, but I wonder if we could get some answers to some of them. Jennifer in Boulder, Colorado says, power is almost always connected to money. Which nations are Antarctica's biggest spenders right now?
That's a really excellent question, Jennifer. And you're absolutely right. Money is integral to everything that countries do and importantly don't do. So the biggest spenders, and it won't really surprise you, first amongst all of them is the United States. China is now a very big polar power, and part of that is science and infrastructure and logistics. The Republic of Korea, for example, is another notable polar actor. The United Kingdom, of course, is very important as well. And we're talking, for example, British Antarctic Survey probably has a budget of around £50 million a year, on top of all the other infrastructure, including, of course, the new polar vessel. The United States will run into hundreds of millions of dollars because, for example, organizing the McMurdo Station in particular is no mean feat. And you only have to think of the logistical challenges and costs of also holding on to a South Pole station. And one of the things I should mention, Martin, as well, about money and science and logistics is location matters as well. So it was really no surprise when the United States established a South Polar Station in the 1950s as part of the International Geophysical Year. You know, as the superpower par excellence, what better way to really make it clear that you think of yourself as number one by putting a base right at the heart of Antarctica. So money talks, And China, of course, has been a big spender over the last 20 odd years.
Thank you. Just to build on your diversity point, a friend of Shackleton, the brand, is Hannah McKeon, who's actually base manager at the Scott Amundsen base at the moment. So how about that?
Yeah, and that's fantastic. And of course, just for the benefit of the audience, the director of British Antarctic Survey is Professor Dame Jane Francis, a very distinguished scientist, and the most senior person, civil servant responsible for British Antarctic policy development is Jane Rumble. So, you know, things are changing. There's always more to do, but it's a very different picture to what it was in the 1940s. Let's put it that way.
Fantastic. Next question is from John Allett. Should man ever colonize the moon or Mars, what can we learn from 100+ years of Antarctic geopolitics? Great.
Well, I have to. That's a great question, because I think there are two things that always strike me. Number one is, you know, we had the International Space Station, which was a kind of remarkable piece of Cold War cooperation, way before really we had any kind of joint Antarctic station. I think one of the things we've learned in the Antarctic is there is a remarkable culture of sharing, in the sense of that, you know, if there's an emergency and you need help, I think it'd be fair to say nobody would not come and help you. And so extreme environments often do engender that sense of collaboration, cooperation, and humanitarianism, I suppose. But on the other hand, we shouldn't also underestimate that extreme environments are not immune to geopolitical, resource, and strategic pressures. So what I would say is that if we start to colonize the moon, for example, or you know, goodness me, the Mars, I don't think we should necessarily assume, you know, there will be an era of goodwill to all those who come and go, and it's worth bearing in mind. For the moment, mining is banned in the Antarctic. We're very clear on that. But it would be fair to say that countries continue to flirt with the idea that the resources, the mineral resources of the Antarctic, could be exploitable at some point in the future. So there's a great deal of uncertainty. So I think it's not.
I was going to say, especially as the ice recedes as well, it gives greater access to the land and therefore makes the logistics relatively easier. I just one other point on that. I remember a conversation with Nick Lambert, who you might know from Spry, and actually currently chairman of the James Caird Society. And he was working on a project 2 or 3 years ago about building a framework for establishing potential territorial claims on the moon. So that's quite a job. Can I jump to another couple of questions? So I've got a question here about the Antarctic Treaty, which was, what is your outlook for the time when the Antarctic Treaty will become modifiable in terms of resources and claims?
Well, the good news is that most journalists completely misunderstand the Antarctic Treaty and often write articles saying, you know, it's going to end or cease to exist at some kind of magical point. You know, 2048 is often cited as being this point where suddenly everything will change. Procedurally speaking, the good news is trying to change the treaty is actually really rather hard. It's not straightforward. And one of the things that I think is really very striking at the moment is the treaty is sufficiently flexible enough to withstand stresses and strains, and for the moment protects the interests of all parties concerned. And without over-laboring the point, there is one article in this treaty, that Article 4, that puts these claims to one side, as I intimated earlier. And it means, therefore, with consensus as well, parties have to be fairly flexible. I mean, this extraordinary case involving New Zealand and Russia over the Palmer affair, it caused ill feeling on the Russians' part. But ultimately, the New Zealand and other parties didn't push as hard as they could have done to expose what they thought was really a prima facie case of illegal fishing. So my sort of cautious optimism is that actually the treaty is more resilient than perhaps some might think. The downside, and this is the thing that I'm more worried about, the downside is actually the treaty just dies by 1,000 cuts, that it's nothing dramatic, it's not something that would make a sort of action thriller, but actually over time, what we call norms just get watered down. And so things that we used to think were incredibly important, like environmental impact assessments, just become more perfunctory. Parties don't bother telling other parties what they're up to until it's already happened. It's that kind of thing. It's an immensely large continent. And so we shouldn't forget that. You can do an awful lot of stuff and actually not necessarily feel the immediate gaze of a near neighbor.
Absolutely. That was a great question from Henry Wolf. So the last question is from me, which is to do with the marine protected areas. We're actually involved, Shackleton's involved with Blue Marine Foundation and their campaign to get these 4 million square miles of Antarctic waters designated as MPAs. And I understand the next sort of major moment for that, when the nations come together to try and make that happen, is next October. I think it's a big CAMLA meeting then. What would be your prediction as to whether that actually does get ratified?
So I'm not very optimistic, and there are lots of reasons why I'm not optimistic. But I think one of the problems, and the marine protected areas really demonstrates this nicely, is the ethos of the Antarctic Treaty system is in essence that we should get intelligent policy making, or intelligent decision making, on the basis of robust scientific evidence. It's a bit like dealing with COVID. We hope, in essence, we're following the science. The problem with that approach is that even if the science is fantastic, parties don't necessarily agree on how to respond to that science. So in the Southern Ocean context, as opposed to a pandemic, parties can disagree profoundly on the balance between what is called the rational use of resources, in other words, fishing, say, and conservation. And what we have at the moment is a distinction that perhaps has become too sharp between countries like China and Russia being portrayed as the exploiters. They're the countries that just keep wanting to fish. And on the other hand, we have the conservationists like the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia, the European Union, who want to protect. And Russia and China, for slightly different reasons, feel that they're being victimized, that actually the finger of blame is always being pointed at them. And they argue that, amongst other things, they're not claimant states. And so the suspicion is that when claimant states in particular promote marine protected areas, they might think they're just being good global citizens. Russia and China and others think, oh no, we know what you're doing. You're using marine protection to bolster your sovereignty claims. And so there is this kind of ongoing tension that whatever Britain does or Australia does, it's always going to be rooted in this concern to protect and enhance sovereignty. And that means that, it's easy for Russia and China to say, we don't trust you.
Yeah, fantastic. That's a great answer. Thank you. We've had at points well over 300 people on the call, and we still have over 200. So I'm absolutely delighted with that, with our opening event for Antarctica Now. Thank you so much, Klaus, for your time this evening. That was a brilliant start, and I think it really helps put into context all the other conversations we're going to have now about conservation, about science, about the ice cores, about tomorrow's talk from Mark Drinkwater about Antarctica from space. That landscape that you've laid out so clearly is going to be super useful for everybody to really put all that into context without having to ask all those basic questions over again. So I'd like to thank you again. That was great. Tomorrow, as I said, is the European Space Agency's Dr. Mark Drinkwater, who's going to be talking about how satellites are used to monitor Antarctica's ice from space. That's going to be totally fascinating. And in the meantime, There are lots of pieces on the website for people to check out, lots of different areas from conservation to science and of course exploration as well. So let us know what you think when you go online. There's lots of opportunity to post and give us your thoughts. So we'll see everybody tomorrow at 6 o'clock. And finally, I'd like to thank the Shackleton team, especially Patrick and Rachel and Charlie, for pulling this together in record time. We only decided to do it in the 3rd week of December, so it's quite a feat to pull together such a great group of speakers before then. So thanks to you, Klaus, thanks to the team, and good night, everybody. Thanks for attending.